Good morning and welcome to the 2021 First Amendment Congress. My name is Andy Moore. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom of Information Oklahoma, and we're so excited to be here again this year. Of course, we wish we were live in person with you. Hopefully, by next year, by 2022, we'll be on the tail side of this pandemic and can safely all gather together. When we started planning this a few months ago, it was during the sharp increase in the Delta wave, and it just feels like over the last 2 years, it is almost impossible to plan anything more than just a couple of weeks out in advance. Nevertheless, thank you for joining us today, wherever you are across the state or the country, in case there's anyone tuning in from somewhere else on the planet. We've got an excellent program for you today. Up first is going to be Dr. Joey Sinnott from Oklahoma State University, a perennial favorite. He will be sharing his presentation about the First Amendment and you. That means you students, right? How this very important piece of our Constitution pertains to you where you're at today. At 10 o'clock, we will have a panel discussion with David Hudson from the Free Speech Center, Tony Childers from the Oklahoma State School Board Association, and Joey Sinnott's going to join for that as well, about from what you wear to what you share, the limits of free speech on and off campus. We're going to talk about some specific cases that have been recently heard or in the news that can really illustrate where the line is with our freedoms. And then at 11, we have an excellent panel, which I've entitled, "This Panel is a Riot." It's about how states are legislating around the First Amendment and around free speech, and including a case here in Oklahoma. So we're very excited, and without further ado, we're going to move right into our first panel. I'm going to welcome to the screen Dr. Joey Sinnott. Hello, sir.
How is everyone? Good morning.
Excellent. Well, we're glad you're here. That reminds me, one of the limits of doing things virtually is that we don't get to see the audience's smiling faces. So if you are watching this from anywhere, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, which is the two places we're streaming this, you can leave comments and they should come through on our end. So if you have a question along the way, if you're watching it as a class, I don't know, pick a designee, ask your teacher, someone to chime in, and you can leave a comment and it should come through on our end so we can answer it. And we'll just cross our fingers and hope that works and that maybe you have questions. Or Joey, perhaps you will just so sufficiently discuss the content that there won't be any questions. Well, I'm going to step off the screen and share Joey's slides, and then we'll get into it.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I do hope, please, that you will participate. Normally, when we do this in person, it is very interactive with the students. And so please, as I'm asking questions, be bold enough to leave some answers. We hopefully will go through this and explain it to you a little better. So let's get started off here. Do we have any students or any schools participating that are from private schools? Do we have any private schools? That would be the next slide. So the reason I asked this is because the question is, well, does the First Amendment protect private school students from censorship by those students? In other words, what's the difference between those who are at private schools and those who are at public schools? So what public schools do we have represented today? You can type that into the comments so we'll know where we're reaching and who's involved here today. So one of the answer to this is there's a big difference between the First Amendment for public school students and those for private students. The difference being there's no state action when it comes to private schools. And state action is simply the idea that for the First Amendment to apply, there has to be some government involvement in the censorship. So if you're at a private school, it's not a government school. But if you are at a public school, yeah, government, you are at a government entity. So the First Amendment does apply. So let's go to the next one. So first question then is, what 5 rights are protected by the First Amendment? Does anyone know? Did anyone know them all before having studied perhaps for this presentation or for this semester? And students out there and the teachers are being awful quiet on this, because usually in the face-to-face, it gets rather raucous. So before we get into what they actually are, I'll give you a hint that very few people can actually name all 5 rights. There's one survey that showed that only less than 0.1% of Americans could actually name all 5 rights. So it protects freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to petition your government about redress of grievances. And then the last one would be, does anybody remember the last one? It's to assemble peacefully. Okay, so those 5 rights each have a lot of cases that go with them to sort of explain then, what does that mean? Often I run into people who basically the First Amendment means free speech for me, but not thee. In other words, I'm all for the First Amendment, but I'd sure like to censor someone else whose speech I don't like. So these cases sort of explain and help elaborate on what the exceptions are to the First Amendment, and they are very narrow and very few. So we've gone through those rights. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. So what do you think your greatest threat, the greatest threat to your First Amendment rights would be? The greatest threat, the problem that faces your First Amendment rights, most endangers them. And so that would be basically your ignorance of those rights. It's really easy to take away people's rights when they don't know they exist. And I see this, hear about this at every conference when students start telling me what's going on at their schools. If you don't know that you have a right to speech, to expression, in other words, at your school, and you don't know what the parameters of that are, what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is protected, then it's easy for school officials to tell you, no, you may not say that. And you're none the wiser to it. You're going to go along with it. It's really hard. I understand it's really hard, particularly when you're in high school, but at any point in life, to stand up to people who are in authority and who are in power. The guy wearing the tie and the white dress shirt, who can be sort of intimidating when they're the school official. But you got to know what your rights are. Sometimes they don't know either. They're acting out of ignorance. Sometimes they do know, and they're hoping you don't know. So having some idea of what your rights are and what you can say is the best way to protect those rights. You have to have some education on it. So let's go to the next slide. There are U.S. Supreme Court decisions that deal with your rights. And the first one, for example, in Tinker, is the one where the students, and actually we had one of those, John Tinker, speak at our conference years ago, is where the students were protesting the Vietnam War. And to protest, they wore some black armbands. So why would a black armband be a means of protest? And this is sort of old-fashioned. You don't see this much anymore, but people used to wear the black armbands as a sign of mourning, of being, in grievement that you've lost someone. So this was a way of saying we are mourning both our soldiers and the Vietnamese people who have died in this war. And a bunch of students, many students were going to be protesting by wearing these bands, and the principal or assistant principal called them in the previous day and said, if you do this, you're going to be suspended. And that drastically cut down the number of students who were going to do it, who actually participated. Again, as I said, it's difficult to stand up to people in authority. Those students didn't know they would eventually win a U.S. Supreme Court case, but they did. And the court said that even students, right? Students retain their First Amendment rights when they cross through that schoolhouse gate. And by the way, they said teachers as well. Now, your rights are not absolute. So in other words, to be absolute would mean that we could say anything we wanted without some sort of punishment or consequences from the government. So there are things that we can be punished for example, obscenity or libel or true threats, and what that actually means, and incitement to illegal action immediately. Those are some areas that you can't say without having some punishment or consequence. However, to say that it's not absolute is not to say that the government can just willy-nilly go out and censor any speech it wants. It can't. Well, so for high school students, if your speech is about a political issue or a social issue or your religious speech, then it is protected on that public university campus. The school said, the U.S. Supreme Court said, even though it's not absolute, school officials cannot censor you solely because those comments related to those areas are offensive to others. In fact, the court said at one point, the fact that you have a viewpoint that's unpopular or that disagrees with other people on your campus, that might start an argument, that might start disturbance. But what the court said it can't, or is when it can be punished, is if it would substantially disrupt or would materially interfere with the order and the educational process, the discipline necessary. So any disruption, no. Substantial disruption, material interference with school activities. Again, because the court said anytime you have a disagreement over, a different idea, that might cause a disruption, but it doesn't rise to the level of substantial disruption or material interference with. So again, simply because what you said about a particular candidate, either supporting or opposing that candidate, other people might disagree, but that is not enough to simply say you're punished. You have a strong First Amendment right to speak up on religious, social, and political issues when you're on your public high school campus. So Bethel is sort of a diversion from that. We were talking about in Tinker the student's personal speech. And Bethel deals with a press conference, a student gathering, one of those assemblies, in which the student was nominating another student for the Student Government Association, student council. And he gave a speech filled with sexual innuendo. And it said stupid stuff like he's a man who's firm in his pants and other nonsensical things. And the students went just nuts in the audience, as you might expect. Well, he was punished, and thinking that he was in the right based on Tinker, this ends up before the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court says, well, the difference between this and Tinker is that the student was at a school-sponsored event, was at a student assembly put on by the school itself. And so it started to draw a distinction between you speaking as an individual and when you are speaking in a forum created solely by the school. So the next case where that comes up is Hazelwood. So if you work for your student yearbook or your student newspaper, you may have heard of Hazelwood. It may have probably been oversold to you as giving school officials absolute authority over your school, the content of your yearbook or your school newspaper, and it does not. It says that school officials can censor for certain reasons. For example, if it's poorly written, if the stories are poorly researched, if they would infringe on someone's privacy. There is a case in the country where a student was writing a story about a lawsuit filed against the school district. And the student tried to interview the school principal and the school superintendent, and all these officials refused to be interviewed. And the school officials then censored the story. Now, this is about a lawsuit that the public newspaper, the commercial newspaper rather, is already published stories on. So this ends up before a federal trial judge who rules in favor of the student. And one of the things the principal had to say up on the stand was, well, yes, I wouldn't have censored it had the student just done our side of the story, just our side of the lawsuit. Well, that's not good journalism, and the court recognized that. So Hazelwood doesn't give them absolute power over your student publication, and it does not require that they censor your student publication. And we had some speakers from Columbus, Ohio years ago, including the principal for the high school, who had chosen not to censor a student newspaper special issue edition when he knew it would be very controversial. Now, the next one, Morse, is the one that we call the Bong Hits for Jesus case, because this young man and some of his friends, this was up in Anchorage, Alaska, the Olympic torch. I don't know if you realize the Olympic torch is brought from the previous site by foot as far as it's possible across to the next site. And so the torch was passing in front of their school. And as it did, these students who had never gotten to school that day, they were on the other side of the street. And as the torch passed, they dropped a banner that said, "Bong Hits for Jesus," whatever that means. So they were suspended for doing this, and they filed suit to challenge that, and made it up to, for example, the Ninth Circuit, which handles the West Coast. And the Ninth Circuit gave them the benefit of the doubt that this was some sort of political message, and said the students won. But the school district appealed, and was the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the appeal and said, no, this was viewed by the U.S. Supreme Court as a reasonably viewed as encouraging illegal drug use. So somehow by reading the words "Bong Hits for Jesus," that was going to encourage students to use marijuana. So I think it's a rather nonsensical statement. The U.S. Supreme Court, in some concurring opinions, did say, though, this could not be used, this ruling could not be used to actually punish students who are speaking for example, legalization of marijuana. And there have been referendums in Alaska on that issue. But they saw this as carving out a little piece from Tinker. And so now if your speech under Tinker, your personal speech, is reasonably viewed as encouraging illegal drug use, then it can be punished. But not if you are speaking on the political issue of legalizing marijuana. Now, the next case, if we can go on, hit to that one, that next slide here, is the sort of the Save the Cheerleader case. And it is the most recent decision this year by the U.S. Supreme Court. And this young woman had found out after school, she finds out that she had not been selected for the senior cheer squad. And she went on Snapchat with some of her friends, and she dropped some F-bombs talking about the school. And some of her friends shared that with some other people, and it made its way to the school officials, who then suspended her. So the question becomes, how much control does your high school have over your off-campus speech? So as the slide points out there, the court recognized that if we're going to let school officials regulate both your on-campus speech and your off-campus speech, that effectively includes all your speech. And so if we're going to stop you from saying certain things both on campus and off campus, you would never get to say those things. So the court looked at the idea of Loco Parentis, which means who's acting as the parent there. And it said something important. It said the responsibility for your off-campus speech normally falls to your parents, not to the school officials. So normally it's your parents who would be upset with you for having a Snapchat in which you dropped a bunch of F-bombs about not being selected to the senior cheer squad. Okay, that normally would not fall to the campus officials. So let's move on to the next slide here. And one of the reasonings the court gave was the idea that we say in this country, I really disagree vehemently with what you're saying, but I am going to defend to the death your right to say that. In fact, I used that saying recently with a faculty member who was from another country who just did not understand that idea. If we disagree with it, we should be able to shut down that speech. Well, that's not the way the First Amendment operates. The First Amendment here is to protect unpopular speech. We don't need it to protect popular speech. Speech that everyone agrees with is not being punished. So the U.S. Supreme Court, in a lot of cases, has recognized that a profound commitment in this country to protect speech that is offensive to the majority. That our idea of the First Amendment is to protect that unpopular speech. So the court here says, school officials really have an interest in protecting that student's unpopular expression to ensure that as we go through generations of students, they understand how that really works, that we're here to protect speech that we don't all agree with. So let's move to the next slide on this. Now, unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court said school officials sometimes may censor in some circumstances. So the First Amendment doesn't protect you off campus from all censorship by your school officials, but it gave some examples. So, for example, if it's serious or severe bullying or harassment of particular individuals, you're targeting specific people. If it's threats, and again, don't have time today, but we would get into what is a true threat, threats aimed at teachers or other students. Failure to follow the rules concerning online lessons or writing papers or computer use or some other online school activities where the school has given you as part of its school function some activity and said, here are the rules to follow. And also, for example, breaches of school security devices. So it said, okay, these are some examples in which school officials still may censor. Let's move on to the next slide here. But it said in this particular case, the school's interest in teaching this student good manners did not overcome the student's interest in free expression. For example, it didn't prove that her posts had caused a serious decline in teen morale to the point where that had substantially interfered with the school's efforts to have this cheerleading team. Now, remember back from Tinker, the Supreme Court said, yes, they could censor when that speech would likely cause substantial disruption of or material interference with school activities. Well, in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court says the school had not proved that her post did that. So the next slide. So the school's interests were also diminished by several factors, one of which was that she had done this outside of school hours and off school campus, outside of school. She had done this elsewhere. She also had not identified the school or targeted any specific teacher or the cheerleader coach. And she had transmitted this through her personal cell phone. It hadn't come through a school computer, in other words, through her personal cell phone to an audience that was consisting of her friends on this circle of Snapchat friends. So those interests ended up combining to say the student was protected. Let's go to the next slide here. And Justice Alito, in a concurring opinion, he points out, again, coming back to the idea that you are at a government institution, a public school, he pointed out that her Snapchat essentially amounted to criticizing government, a public school, and that if some adult had said those same things on Snapchat, they would have gotten such strong protection from the First Amendment that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, those state officials would have not even bothered to try to punish that adult. So remember, sometimes and we have to remember this as teachers and even public university teachers, that we are still public employees. And so the question is, by the way, very fact-based. Every case hinges on applying the law to the specific facts of that case. But if a student is criticizing the school or a teacher for policies or actions, then that may well be protected by the First Amendment. So I was gonna, does anybody at this point have any particular instances that have come up at your schools that you would like to bring up? You can start putting them into the comments if you have specific questions about, well, we were told we couldn't say this or we couldn't say that. One quick example would be, have you been told at your schools that you may not wear the little wrist bracelets that say, for example, I heart boobies, which used to be handed out as a way to recognize Breast Cancer Month. So years and years ago, I would hear from students that they were being told they couldn't wear those, students were being punished for it. Well, that was, students were actually punished in another federal circuit, and they challenged it, excuse me, and the federal appellate court agreed with the students and said they were entitled to wear those, that they were not, they were still a social message, that students were protected. We have a student a few years ago at Deer Creek who was told he had to remove his Black Lives Matter shirt. And he had worn it several times to school, and nobody in the administration had noticed. This time they told him he had to take it off. Well, that's political speech. Now, the school officials tried to argue that that was divisive. The ACLU of Oklahoma stepped in to help the young man. That is not divisive. Black Lives Matters is a social political issue. It doesn't matter if it's divisive because some people are offended by it or don't like it. As the U.S. Supreme Court has said, simply having a different viewpoint can cause disagreement. We need to teach students in high school that the First Amendment protects differing viewpoints. And this usually brings up the idea of why it's important to learn these in high school. I'd love to know what percentage of Oklahomans you believe go on to earn a college degree. That would be the next place where you would learn about your First Amendment rights. It's actually only about 25% of our adult population now has earned a bachelor's degree. And I can tell you, even if when students go on to college, they don't necessarily get a class in the First Amendment. They don't get a media law or constitutional law class. It's important then that you learn these in high school. And when we have students growing up K through 12 in public school systems where they're constantly told government can control your speech, government can decide if it's too offensive, you must always be nice to everyone in what you say. In other words, you can't espouse ideas that other people don't like. That's not the way the First Amendment works. And a lot of us are afraid we're raising generations of students who think it's okay for government to control your speech on political, religious, social issues, that you must always be nice to people when you speak to them on those issues. We would prefer you have civil discourse and be nice in that conversation. But the U.S. Supreme Court and our own state Supreme Court have long recognized that sometimes people get angry and say things and are not always nice when they have those kinds of arguments. So, we hope that you're learning by coming to this today, that you're learning something then about what your First Amendment rights are and what that would mean. Now, let's go to an example from another state. This student wore, and this is several years ago, he wore up in Dearborn, Michigan. He wore a T-shirt, and that's a picture of then President George Bush, and it says International Terrorist. And he had actually worn the shirt several times before. And one day at lunch, a school administrator, recognized it and said, you have to change that. Well, this young man knew what his First Amendment rights were, and he argued with him. And he actually challenged this in court. A civil liberties group helped him with that. So the question is, does he have a right under the First Amendment to wear that shirt? And so to answer that, you start looking first at, all right, so which of those Supreme Court cases, Supreme Court of the United States, which one of those Supreme Court cases would apply here and why? And what would be the key questions? So you would say, well, all right, my choices are between Tinker, which deals with his political beliefs and expressing those on campus, versus, for example, Hazelwood. And this is clearly not a school newspaper or school publication of any kind. It is not an assembly where he is speaking at. So you would say it's not Morse, it's not encouraging drug use, and it's not off campus. So now you would argue that even the cheerleader case could not possibly apply anyway. Although I would say that if he was wearing that off campus or putting that online, the school certainly could not have punished him for that. So we would go with Tinker. And the question becomes, all right, does his speech, would it likely cause a substantial disruption of or material interference with school activities? And if we go to the next slide, we'll start to see, go ahead and click on one more here. So the federal trial judge applied Tinker and pointed out this is the student's personal political speech. This is not a school-sponsored learning experience. So let's go on to the next one here. So those key questions to the next one would be, all right, what kind of speech is this? And this would be considered pure political speech, just like those armbands were pure political speech in the Tinker case. So could school officials demonstrate then that his speech would likely cause that substantial disruption? And the answer was no, and he had worn it several times and it didn't cause any problems, any disagreements. Remember, the fact that some people might be offended by his speech is not enough. If we go on to the next slide here. And this federal trial judge even said, look, students benefit when they're in an environment where they can express diverging opinions. You learn to tolerate the opinions of others. Maintaining a school community of tolerance includes tolerance of even the intolerant or disagreeable viewpoints. In other words, we don't all have to agree on political, social, and religious issues. And the court ruled in favor of the student, said he was protected in this case to wear that. Now, by the way, there was also another case where a student, and by the way, the student in this case is talking about the Iraq War. That's what he's concerned about. Well, there's a case in another school district somewhere where a student is actually punished for wearing a t-shirt that says "Whack Iraq." So it works both from the left and the right, liberal and conservative viewpoints. Someone's always wanting to censor the other side. Let's go into the next slide. This is a different circumstance. Since we just had Halloween Sunday, sometimes schools allow you to wear costumes for Halloween, maybe on the Friday before or when Halloween falls during the school week. So this young woman, and that's her mom in the background there, she has put condom packages all over her t-shirt. And the question is, does she have a First Amendment right to wear a t-shirt covered in packaged condoms? So let's go on to the next slide here. So again, the question is, which Supreme Court case would apply and why, and what would the key questions be? So is this school supervised learning environment? Is this a school assembly? Is this a school newspaper? Or is she expressing her own views on this social issue? And if we go to the next slide, we'll start to see why she did that. Okay, so she got the idea after watching some MTV commercials promoting safe sex. And she said, look, a lot of my friends are sexually active, and I tell them, if you're going to do this, be safe. Okay. She had friends who had unwanted teen pregnancies, friends who had come down with STD, sexually transmitted diseases. And her message was, please be safe. And she was allowing students, to her classmates, she was handing out the condoms from her shirt. She had taped them on, and she would unpeel them and hand them out. And the school officials were very upset. Let's go on to the next slide on here. So by 8:30, she had handed out about 50 condoms to her classmates. Let's move on to the next one. And so her mother had actually helped her do this. Her mother works, who is HIV positive, works with AIDS and HIV outreach programs down in Florida, said, I didn't think there's anything wrong with this. She's speaking out to her friends in a positive way about dealing with this problem. That's a social issue. Both of them are talking about, here's our solution. We're trying to get a message across with this costume we're wearing. So let's go down to the next one. So the school suspended her for 3 days for being a class disruption and having an insolent attitude. Now, they later shortened that to 1 day. I don't know that she ever sued, by the way. I can never find more stories about this. But the idea that it was simply a class disruption and having an insolent attitude, those should never survive scrutiny by a federal court under the First Amendment. It would have to be substantial disruption, material interference with. And her having an insolent attitude is not something I would see a court upholding. So let's go on to the next slide here. The principal had said, by passing out condoms, you're acknowledging having sex. Our school's position is abstinence. Now, let's go back to that Morse case for a second, the Bong Hits for Jesus case. One of the things the school district wanted in that case was the U.S. Supreme Court to agree that any student message that conflicted with the school's position on an issue, any student expression that would conflict with that school's position could be punished. And the U.S. Supreme Court did not agree with that. So the fact that the school's position is abstinence really doesn't matter in this situation. The dress code prohibiting clothing that advocates sex or drugs does not condone distributing condoms on school grounds. That was the principal's idea. Well, advocating for sex, she wasn't. She was advocating that if you are going to have sexual activities, that you do it safely. And it is absolutely insane to argue that students in high school are not sexually active. And normally, if we were meeting in person, for example, over at UCO or at my school somewhere, and we were all together, I would ask you all, how many of you know someone who has an unwanted teen pregnancy in your high school? And most of the hands go up. How many of you know someone who has an STD? And lots of hands go up. So to simply argue that we're going to, act like an ostrich and stick our head in the sand and ignore this problem, she was doing, the student was trying to do something about it. And I am certain that a federal court would have upheld her right to do that in this case. If not the trial court, then certainly the appellate courts. Let's move on down to the next slide here. And something that would have helped her was when the school board chairman says, students have a right to free speech as long as it doesn't interfere with education. Well, again, it's not any interference, it's material interference with. And the fact that he, as you see in that slide, at the bottom of that slide, I think she tried to make a statement to school that I personally find offensive. And that was really what it boiled down to. The school officials found what she was doing offensive. That is not enough. And by the way, in court, your attorneys would go and look up these kinds of comments that the school officials had made, either publicly in the media or to each other in their emails, had put in text messages to each other, and they look for these things and look for, why is the school doing this? And because they were offended, solely because they were offended is not a justification for that. So let's go on to the next slide here. And as Tinkers, I've been sort of paraphrasing parts of this again, and this is important for you to see. Tinker says any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, on campus, that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take that risk. And our history says this sort of hazardous freedom is the basis for our national strength and of the independence and vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. We often argue. That's what Americans do. And we often disagree. But that marketplace of ideas in which we disagree, that's how we come about with the truth, with some consensus. You wouldn't want me deciding for everyone what you all get to hear. I wouldn't want one of you deciding what I get to hear, the viewpoints, the ideas, the expression. So we don't want to put that in the hands of a government official, a school principal, a school district chairman, the superintendent. That's not the way we do things in the United States under the First Amendment. All right, I think we have time. Let's go on to another slide here. So we also have issues where students wear pro-gay messages to school. And so does the First Amendment protect that student's right to wear those? And sometimes school officials will say, well, we can't allow them to do this because, they might get beaten up. Well, that is giving power to what we would call a heckler's veto. In other words, the most intolerant people are permitted to physically stop someone else's allowable speech. School officials have a responsibility to protect the student, just as they do, you will find later in life. You will see groups at a protest arguing against each other. You'll notice that the police are simply keeping them apart. They're not stopping one side or the other. As long as they are not violent, they can yell and scream anything they want. School officials have a responsibility to protect that speaker and to punish those who would physically, and that's not then expression. A physical attack on someone is not an expression. So this comes down to a case in which Supreme Court case would you apply? And it would be likely then Tinker, because that is a student's private, religious, social, or political message. And we had a case in Florida where a school principal did not like this kind of speech and got upset with the student and suspended her for wearing these pro-gay messages. Her friends rallied to her side and also began wearing pro-gay messages. And some of them just included rainbows on their backpacks and on their clothing. And the principal kept suspending these students because he was anti-homosexual and he did not believe they should be expressing that in a public school. So the students challenged this in court. And when the school district tried to say that the students had caused the disruption because so many of them had been suspended, the court said, no, the school principal caused the disruption by first violating their First Amendment rights. And he was the one who continued to basically persecute, the court said, persecute these students and suspended so many of them that caused the material disruption. Now, the kicker to that case is, and by the way, the students won money for their attorney fees and for some injury, but the kicker is they then took that school principal and gave him a choice of now going and working in the administration building or teaching. He was no longer going to be a principal. And the kicker is, unfortunately, he began teaching an American government class. So I worry about what the students in his American government class would be learning. If you've, one last thing here, by the way, if you don't realize this, the U.S. Supreme Court has also, way back in the 40s, dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, students of that religion in a school, said you have the right not to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance or to sing the national anthem or stand up with the national anthem. Because it pointed out, remember in the 40s, we had just come out of, at this point, World War II, and the court says, the school system is not here to indoctrinate our students essentially the same way the Nazis did. You have a right, a religious, political right to not stand up, to protest when that happens at your public school. So we did have an instance of that in a high school here in the state with this semester. The students refused to stand up and eventually got into an argument with the teacher and were arrested. And the school's argument back is now that they were not arrested for not standing up. They were arrested for the argument. So I want to leave you with this. When someone in authority is trying to censor you, and I know it's hard to do this, stay calm. Take deep breaths. Don't argue back. Don't scream back. Stay calm. Because if you do the opposite, if you get into that argument, then your behavior becomes what they try to punish, and it becomes the main issue. Stay calm. Record. You've got cell phones, smartphones. If you've got one with you, record what's happening and then take it to someone. You're always welcome to email me, but I will send you on to, for example, the ACLU of Oklahoma or the Student Press Law Center or even a group called FIRE. And they have attorneys who will step in and try to help you. So if this happens to you, stay calm, record it if you can, and then seek help afterward. And I thank you for joining us, and I hope you've learned something. You're always welcome to email me. If you have questions, you can find me at the OSU directory.
Thank you, Joey. That was excellent as always. I think I say this every year because it's true every year. I learn something every time you do this that either I forgot the last year or it didn't resonate quite the same as it has this year. Well, Joey, I know you're going to join us for our next panel, so I'll let you hide backstage for a moment. Audience at home or school, wherever you are watching, thank you for being here. Again, if you have questions or comments or a chance to chime in during any of these panels, please do. You can put your message in the chat box. I think probably most of you are watching on YouTube, and so there should be like the comment section below, and those will come through to our end. Okay, we've got about 9 minutes until the top of the hour, so we're going to have a little brief intermission so we can, get caffeinated and do those things, and we'll be back at 10 o'clock. Hello and welcome back to the 2021 First Amendment Congress. Again, my name is Andy Moore. If you're just joining us, welcome. I'm the Executive Director of FOI Oklahoma. And for our next panel, we've got three excellent panelists to be sharing information. This one's called From What You Wear to What You Share, The Limits of Free Speech on and Off Campus. Now, if you joined us for our 9 o'clock discussion from Joey Sinnott, you heard some of that information and some really great tangible illustrations of where our intersection of our rights and the education system meet. And we're going to kind of further or continue that conversation during this session. So joining me today for this is Joey Sinnott. We'll add him back to the screen. Hi, Joey. Also joining us is David Hudson from the Free Speech Center. Hi, David.
Hey.
And then Tony Childers from the Oklahoma State School Board Association. Hi, Tony.
Hi.
I intentionally did super brief introductions with just your name and title because I would like to hear a little bit from each of you about where, I mean, we'll answer this question. I'll call on you and you can say, what do you feel is the most important nugget? Right off the bat, what's the most important thing that students should know about the limits of free speech on and off campus? Does that make sense? The most important thing students should know about the limits of free speech on and off campus. And then we'll get into the discussion. So, Joey, since you've already been in this brain space for an hour, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, I was trying to get out of the way of Tony and David. So, I think the point I left students with a minute ago was, you have to know what your rights are. And by the way, it's not always clear cut. Otherwise, we wouldn't need attorneys to decide this. But know what your rights are. And if you think they're being violated, then stay calm so that your actions in response to that censorship don't become the issue. But, you have to know what your rights are. Otherwise, it's just too easy for people to take them away from you when you don't have a clue that you had them in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thanks, Joey. David, I'll go to you next.
I agree with Joey. I also, on the other end of that, I would say that students really do need to appreciate that, particularly online communication, that you can't just do whatever you want. While the U.S. Supreme Court has, I thought, issued by and large a darn good opinion in the Madnoy case back in this summer, social media is not a legal free zone, and you can defame people, you can invade their privacy, you can engage in cyberbullying. And so I think a good lesson for all of us sometimes, particularly in politically polarizing times, is to think before we post sometimes.
That's sage advice. I don't care how old you are. That's very important. Thanks, David. Tony, how about you?
Yeah, so I may take a little bit of I come from a different side of things since I work with schools for the most part in my career. And what I would say is very similar to what the other two panelists said, is you have to be careful what you post online, but remember that schools are limited in how they approach student speech. And as you probably heard earlier in the prior presentation, students, you don't shed your rights at the schoolhouse gates. And now with this newest case, Mahanoy, we know that there's a limit in terms of how far a school can go outside of those gates. So one thing I always try to tell my schools as well is when it comes to student speech, it's really not about the content of the speech. It's always about how is that affecting the school's ability to carry out its mission, which is to educate students. So it's not really about the content of the speech. In most cases, there are exceptions to that. It's more about how is this affecting the school day and affecting the school's ability to educate students.
Tony, can I follow up on that and ask you, do you see, and this, I won't hold you to the answer here, but do you see that uncertainty or confusion about where that line is more on school's end or on students' end, or is it really a combination of both?
since I primarily deal with schools, I could only talk from the school side of things, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and that leads to lots of questions from schools, or maybe even a misunderstanding of thinking a student did this particular or said something particular, we're going to suspend them, and hopefully they give a call to their retained attorney or to our office and ask a question, and we help guide them through the analysis of, well, just because you disagree with what they said doesn't mean that you can automatically react to it. So there is definitely, I don't want to say confusion, but uncertainty when it comes to the line of when something is happening at home, whether it be a comment on Facebook that's perceived as bullying or threatening, or simply just a statement made by a student on their own time, where is the school's limit in how they can act?
Yeah. Well, and I think Joey shared an example in his earlier presentation of the student who had the condoms taped to their shirt, and the school board member said that they found it personally offensive. And that was like a clear misunderstanding of what the law allows and who's the one there. David, I want to ask you a question more about students then. We host an annual First Amendment essay contest in conjunction with this First Amendment Congress, and we hope to be announcing the winner later this morning. One of the things I took away from reading dozens and dozens of essays is the, I will say, misunderstanding on the part of students that the First Amendment protects their right to say whatever they want without repercussions whatsoever. And that's not exactly the case. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. You know, the text of the First Amendment reads in absolutist terms, right? Congress shall make no law, ... abridging the freedom of speech. And I certainly believe in protection of free speech. And one of the most surprising things in Mahanoy was Justice Breyer actually said that school officials have a duty to protect unpopular student speech, writing the schools are nurseries of democracy. But the point is that there's always been what the U.S. Supreme Court defined as narrow and limited classes of speech that are not protected. The Supreme Court held this back in 1942 in a case called Shaplinski versus New Hampshire. And even aside from what we normally think of as speech-related categories, when I try to talk to students about it, I say, well, you don't have a First Amendment right to commit perjury in court. You don't have a First Amendment right to extort money from someone. You don't have a First Amendment right to utter a true threat at someone. You don't have a First Amendment right to traffic in obscenity or child pornography. So there are these limits on freedom of expression. What I also think is important to convey, however, is if we look at the history of free expression, many of these unprotected categories started out as pretty large, and they've narrowed significantly over time. But it certainly is true, and I think the one that students need a little bit more education on sometimes is defamation. Yes, some statements can be dismissed as mere rhetorical hyperbole or just an insult, but certain statements, if you make a false statement of fact that harms somebody's reputation, particularly if you know it's false, that's defamation, right? And that's a problem. So there are limits to free speech.
Sure, and I guess a follow up is maybe more specifically, a student's right to free speech does not mean that they would be free from social blowback, right? They may say something that is socially unpopular, and perhaps the school recognizes that they don't have the authority to censor that, but that doesn't mean that all of their peers have to be, emotionally okay with what they say.
Yeah, and I think there's a disconnect. What I like to phrase it this way: there's sort of a disconnect between the First Amendment ideal and the real. One of the most fundamental of all First Amendment free speech principles is that the First Amendment should protect offensive, disagreeable, obnoxious, and even repugnant speech. Justice William Brennan referred to that as the bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment. And I think there's semblances of that in Justice Breyer's opinion in Mahanoy. But and there have been some great I remember the very first published federal district court opinion dealing with student internet speech, I believe, was the Busink case out of Missouri, in the Eastern District of Missouri. Judge Rodney Sipple said something to the effect, disliking student speech is not an acceptable justification for limiting it under Tinker. And that's true. But oftentimes when the speech is offensive enough, it gets censored. And so there is this disconnect between the First Amendment ideal and what actually happens.
Sure. And I think, right now we're at a unique point in American history where we collectively, schools and otherwise, are having to wrestle with, what do we do with a preponderance of opinions, of speech out there, and how do we handle it if we are concerned about its negative implications on particular groups of people or on democracy as a whole. And so I feel like this is a very timely topic for us to be discussing today. Joey, I know you wanted to talk about a specific case. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, not so much a case yet, but an instance, and I don't know what exactly happens. But I just want to go back to one point: the idea that, sometimes people misunderstand when we say there can be consequences. We're talking about other people's disagreement with what you said. That doesn't mean that's free reign for government to step in and do what it wants. And also the idea that just because, as I said earlier, just because it's not absolute, as I'd even said earlier too, those areas that are exceptions are well established and pretty narrow at this point. And so people say, well, it's not absolute, so I can censor your speech now. That's not what, government, the attempt to censor is given a pretty high bar to get over to justify censorship of that speech. In other words, that speech is put up here and government's attempt to start way down there. And I see that even on a public university campus, a lot of confusion about that, even among faculty, about what the First Amendment even means for college students. And they theoretically have far more rights than even a high school student. But so getting back to the high school student, I want to make sure for both our speakers. So this was a case that came up in Olathe, Kansas. And officials said they were investigating a student who had recently posted a photo of a homecoming invitation. And this was written out on this paper or something. It was really big, and it was him asking the young woman to go to homecoming, and it said, quote, "If I was black, I would be picking cotton, but I'm white, so I'm picking you." And the school principal said any behavior like this will be immediately addressed in accordance with our student code of conduct. And this was done online. And so I wonder, where do we see the cheerleader case, the Save the Cheerleader case, applying in this situation? I mean, I know we've got a long way to go to see how lower courts start to interpret and apply that decision. But do you have any immediate reaction, either Tony and David, about what you think that student's speech is going to be protected, or does it fall outside of what the Supreme Court said in that case?
I would say it's gonna rely heavily on, as an attorney would tell you, the facts. What are the actual, what is the reach back to the school district at that point? I know this is connected to a dance that was probably school sponsored, but what effect has it actually had on the school district and its ability, as I said before, its ability to educate kids or educate students? Has there been blowback at school? Has it created issues? Is there a history of issues that might relate to this? That would all heavily affect how a court might view that specific case.
Yeah, one thing that's been a little troubling is that I think there have been 3 federal district court decisions post-Manaway, and they've all gone against the student. And so it looks like so far what federal district courts are doing is they're really parsing that language in Justice Breyer's opinion, where he says schools do retain regulatory interest over cyberbullying, harassment. He lists a long list of categories. Justice Alito, in his concurring opinion, questions whether, the dangers of drafting, harassment and bullying laws and comporting with the First Amendment. I think, obviously, I agree with Tony. The facts will matter heavily, and whether there's enough of a connection there to establish that reasonable forecast of substantial disruption. If you look at Manoy from the big picture, it does say that the vast array of student social media speech should be off limits, or maybe not vast array, but a significant chunk of it. But the more that you can tie those nexuses together between the speech and stuff that happens at school or any sort of event, and it looks like, I haven't been as pleased with the federal district court decisions that have been coming down post Manoy. It does seem to be fairly much pro school official so far, but I think we'll have to wait and see and just see when he. To
clarify for the teachers and the students, and what Tony's also alluding to is, if there are cases that, for example, if you have a history of racial violence at your school, and you are a white student and you want to wear a Confederate flag belt or shirt or something, then a school official could reasonably, or courts, I think at least I know of one case for sure off the top of my head, who've said, that would likely cause a substantial disruption at the school because there's already been a history of racial violence here, and this symbol is likely to instigate more of that. And so I guess I think maybe what Tony is saying too is the question is, what is the history of that at the school, and does this racially charged language then cause more disruption at the school in that case? I also want to make a point, though. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, guys. A point I have to make to people is racist speech is still protected by the First Amendment. So right now we're talking about in the context of a school, but once you leave that school, it is not illegal to say racist things. The better solution from our side is not to say, I'm going to censor you, but to have counter speech, because I can guarantee you, having grown up in South Louisiana, you cannot convince racists they are wrong by censoring them. You turn them into the victim in their minds. But that counter speech doctrine becomes really important. Unfortunately, as I said in the first session, I think students K through 12 are told largely now government can control what you say. And part of that is you can't say anything that's racist. I don't know how many students we have. One of the first things I have to get out of their minds in our First Amendment lectures is, First Amendment still protects racist and hateful speech. It has to go into true threats or incitement before it's not protected.
Those can be pretty high standards to meet, as you said. Those can be pretty limited. One thing that I would kind of also point out, and I always try to point this out when I'm doing training for administrators or board members, is sometimes you get a weird result where certain speech at one school district is not an issue. It's not something that the administration would have any kind of authority to discipline for or restrict. While at another school district, you could have the exact same speech. Maybe it's a different student body with a different cultural makeup, and that speech is now something that could be restricted. And again, that really just emphasizes the fact that it's not about the content. And as administrators and board members, they have to remember that they are a political subdivision of the state, so they are the government. And so anytime they take action to restrict any kind of speech or discipline for speech, whether that be like in Mahanoy, taking them off of an extracurricular, which many tend to think, oh, it's an extracurricular, they don't have the same rights. Any kind of consequence that comes about because of speech is likely going to get you into a First Amendment issue. And you have to go through this analysis of, is it appropriate? Does it meet the standards in Tinker? Does it meet the standards of one of the other cases, Frazier, for example, before you make that decision?
Your comment about extracurriculars is where my mind was. And so if I put myself in the shoes of a student or a parent or teacher, where's that line drawn? So I think most people would kind of understand things that happen at school are maybe more clearly defined, and then you've got extracurricular, you've got sports, you've got dances. But like, what if it's a fundraiser for the PTA, or it's a fundraiser for a sports team, or something that's like 2 degrees removed from the traditional school day? How do you define the line, if it exists, of where the school's authority extends?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've seen some cases even where a student, and this is kind of outside of First Amendment, but was doing some activity over the summer, and the school is trying to discipline for their activity, not necessarily their speech. So there definitely is a limit to what a school district can do. It's not necessarily clear to me, at least in terms of some of these outside, extracurriculars. If it's something that's sponsored by the school with students that are either required to be there or asked to be there, I'm thinking particularly of the Bong Hits for Jesus case out of Alaska, where the students were told to come out and they can watch the Olympic torch go through town. It was an activity outside of school, but students were asked to come as part of the school day, and that was still really a school-sponsored event. So again, that's one of those areas that's not necessarily clear. There's always the fun part of being an attorney, of those uncertainties, where you get the questions about, well, what if this and what if that? And it's hard to say necessarily there's a bright line of what would be considered a school activity. But generally, if it's something sponsored by the school and the students are told to be there, or as part of some kind of part of the curriculum, then that would definitely fall within what we would consider to be the school day. Outside of that, then you're looking at those factors in Mahanoy of, to what extent is it affecting the school?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the gradient there and the uncertainty, because the next place my mind went was about the end of the school year, what happens during the summer, and if the summer doesn't count, then what about spring break or fall break? Like really trying to get down, and I'm sure that's why we pay attorneys the big bucks to hash this out for us. David, I wanted to go back to what you said in your opening statement about cautioning, just telling people to be conscientious of what they post on social media. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that and kind of how you frame that guidance for students in particular?
Well, certainly. I mean, somebody said it better than I did. Like, free speech has consequences, and there's a certain type of speech, if it's considered to be targeted harassment or bullying, that may run afoul of violating a school code of conduct that prohibits cyberbullying. In some jurisdictions, there are actually criminal cyberbullying statutes. Now, some of those have been struck down. I know one of the People versus Marquand M in New York, and I can't remember the name, the Bishop case, I think out of North Carolina. There have been some laws that have been invalidated. But I think a big concern is there's a difference between really intemperate offensive speech and what school officials and others might view as targeted harassment or bullying, where you're really singling out a specific individual or a group of individuals, small group of individuals, and targeting them. And I think those type of posts you really have to be careful about. Second area I would warn students about is there is an exception for true threats. And the U.S. Supreme Court created that back in 1969, a case called Watts versus United States. It involved a 19-year-old African-American protester who was essentially protesting the Vietnam and the racially disproportionate application of the draft. And the court said that we have to distinguish between what's a true threat and what's protected speech. And frankly, the Supreme Court has struggled mightily in the ensuing decades on actually defining what is a true threat. But the danger for students is that the lower courts have expanded the true threat doctrine in the school context, particularly post-Columbine and some of these other school shootings, to where sometimes violent themed student speech even if it's not a true threat, is considered to be a true threat. And there's all sorts of punishments imposed upon students. And the courts use a test from the Eighth Circuit called the Dinwiddie test. That's a very flexible test that allows school officials to look, for example, at the history of the student, their disciplinary record, the reaction of the recipient. And it's a very flexible test. It's, I often talk to my students about whenever you see a totality of the circumstances type analysis, that tends to favor the government, not the individual. But I do worry about those students who are really creative, but they engage in violent themed expression. And then suddenly they're deemed to have uttered a threat. There are all sorts of cases like this. One of my favorite from years ago is Bowman versus a Blue Stem Unified School District out of Kansas, I believe, where a young student did a piece of concentric art and she posted it on the door. It's like, who killed my dog? Who killed my dog? Did you kill my dog? I'll kill you. And it really was a piece of art. And instead, the court found that it was a form of protected speech. But that still didn't stop the school from imposing discipline on her and then wanting her to go see a psychiatrist and evaluate her. And there's a lot of cases like this. There's a lot of examples of it where it's violent themed. Schools have a duty to protect students from violence. Student posts or says something that's considered off. And there's all sorts of problems. There's a case that came out this week from the state of Wisconsin where a kid posts some stuff on Instagram and Snapchat, and another student or another young person thinks that it's a true threat, and they both happen to be at the same movie theater. So the one kid goes and tells the authorities, and the other kid ends up getting arrested. And the court here in this instance says, well, this was one of these weird coincidences and it was an overreaction. But it just shows that if you sometimes engage in violent themed expression, there can be these really negative consequences, and they're not even intended. It's a lot of times it's somebody that, like the N. Ray George T case out of California, where the kid just was into dark poetry. So that's concerning. I think the other area that's worth mentioning is there's all sorts of public employees who've been disciplined for social media posts. This is more teachers and students, so maybe drifting off track. But we've seen a litany of cases where teachers get online and post stuff that's either negative about their students, negative about coworkers, or negative about the principals or the school board. And while the Marvin Pickering case back in 1968 protected teacher Marvin Pickering's letter to the editor of the Lockport East Herald because he was talking about people that he didn't work with, didn't have close working relationships with, what we're seeing is that speech, that negative speech by teachers about people in their specific school, has led to a significant number of teachers being disciplined and or fired. So that's a real problem too.
We have a case in this state that dealt, I was trying to look it up just now, it was a long time ago, where a student wrote, she was talking about, I think, her English teacher, and she wrote some not so nice things. And then she wrote, I think she wrote it 137 times, if I remember them, killed the B word over and over and over and over and over again. And then she apparently dropped that in the hallway, and a school, I think another student picked it up, but gave it to the school, and the school waited 3 days before they even brought her in. And the federal trial judge, I think this was in Owasso school district, actually sided with the student, but in part because of that reaction that they waited 3 days. They couldn't, the court said you didn't see it as a real true threat if you waited 3 days, if you really thought she was going to do something. On the other hand, the court did say they have an obligation to investigate this kind of speech, but they can't have simply a blanket prohibition on speech that might have some violent connotation to it, but they should investigate. And as I think we've all said at one point or another, it comes down to the facts of the case. And And in this situation, waiting 3 days clearly showed they didn't think she was actually a true threat. So if you thought she was going to kill somebody or a teacher, you would act much sooner than that, like as in when you first got, the note was handed to you. So.
Another one, if I may tell a story, this is one I use as a horror story too, is the Adam Porter case out of Louisiana, where this kid's younger brother, Adam Porter himself draws a picture of his school being firebombed. And he writes it in this sketch pad, and he puts it in a closet where it remains for 2 years. And then his younger brother takes the sketch pad, not knowing the drawing is in there, takes it on the school bus and shows his drawing to another student. The other student flips through the sketch pad and sees the fire bomb drawing. Adam Porter is arrested and spends 6 days in jail for pure speech. For pure speech that was uttered 2 years prior. It was drawn 2 years prior. I found that it's called Porter versus Ascension School District. I still remember it. And that was just stunning to me that happened to the poor kid. What made it worse is when they go search the kid, they find a box cutter on him. Well, this is shortly a couple of years after 9/11, box cutters. Well, he had a part-time job at Kroger's. But now he's this wild, dangerous threat, and gets locked up for 6 days. Wow. Terrible.
And there's also, from the school side of things, there is pressure on the school districts in terms of there's state legislation about when a school thinks that there might be a threat, that it has to be reported. Obviously, other liability concerns and everything. Columbine and post-Columbine has really put administrators on edge that anytime they see a threat or something that they think could possibly be a threat, their immediate reaction is, we have to do something, we have to do it quickly. And we always try to explain to them, First Amendment can protect speech even if you don't agree with the way it's written or the content. And unless you can really show that this is a threat against your school district, against your students, there's limitations there. And I just feel there's that pressure on school districts to act, which is obviously making things more difficult for students as well. I don't always find it the case that schools are out there searching. I think this is the case with some nationwide. I've seen some litigation over this. But schools aren't necessarily out there searching, just waiting to find something that they could discipline a student for. That's not necessarily the hope of the schools, just to try to bring a student down. But there is a genuine concern of how do we react to some of these threats that we perceive to be a threat. In fact, there is a case in the 10th Circuit right now, I believe, where a student in Colorado had dressed up in a Nazi uniform and made a comment about going after those of the Jewish faith. He thought it was funny. It was taken to be a threat by the school district, and the student immediately took down the post within 30, 45 minutes, apologized for it, said he didn't really mean for it to come across that way. And we're waiting to see what happens with the 10th Circuit on that one. So it's one of those where it's a close call where the school district's trying to respond to a situation, but they have to be careful in how they do it.
That's interesting. I mean, it strikes me that there are perhaps competing and moving incentives that might differ for school boards or for school administration, and then for students as well. Something that David said earlier made me think about this. I guess I'm just going to ask outright on behalf of students everywhere, are public school codes of conduct, including dress codes, are they compatible with the First Amendment? Where does that line get crossed?
Well, I can give you one example of one I found very interesting. There is certainly a significant degree of deference that's given to schools, and you'll see a strain of thought, and particularly the federal judiciary, well, they'll say something like, we're not the superintendent, and we have to defer to school administrators who are making these difficult judgments. Let me give you an example of a provision of a dress code that was invalidated. And it was a dress code in Virginia, a school district in Virginia, that had a provision in its dress code that prohibited any clothing that related to weaponry. And the idea is that we don't want to promote guns, we don't want school shootings, we don't want violence. There was a kid who wore a T-shirt. He went to a shooting camp with his father and was very proud of it. And so he wore the shirt to school and was prohibited from doing so. The NRA funded his lawsuit, and it went up to the Fourth Circuit. And the Fourth Circuit ruled that that provision of the dress code was unconstitutionally overbroad. And they did, when you find out whether something's overbroad or not, there has to be substantially overbroad. That's a limitation that the U.S. Supreme Court developed in a 1973 case called Broderick versus Oklahoma, I believe. But what was very interesting is they said, well, if we look at the state seal of Virginia, it has a woman standing over holding a spear, and a spear is a weapon. And then it provided other examples of a lot of school mascots, shirts with school mascots, and they have weapons. And so the Fourth Circuit, not always known as a bastion of free speech, invalidated that part of the dress code. So there are challenges that are made to specific provisions. For example, if you have a dress code that says no inappropriate clothing, and you don't define that, then I think you're opening yourself up to both an overbreadth and a vagueness challenge. That said, the bulk of case law will uphold dress code policies in toto, but give students the right to protest those dress codes. We had a case in Tennessee, at a Wilson County, Tennessee, where there were students who objected to the dress code, mandatory dress code, and I think they wore black armbands mirroring the Tinker plaintiffs. And the federal district court said, no, the dress code's constitutional, but the students do have the right to protest the dress code respectfully. And there's a lot of cases we can look at with regard to dress codes. I think the Fifth Circuit has a few of the leading opinions, and then there's the Jacobs opinion out of the Ninth Circuit. Canada versus Bossier Parish School District out of the Fifth Circuit is a good one. But what they'll say is that the dress code as a whole might be passed. It's not intended to suppress free expression under the O'Brien test of the First Amendment. It's designed to create an environment that's more conducive to learning. That said, yes, codes of conduct, specific provisions of codes of conduct and dress codes can be challenged, but there often is a significant level of deference given in this area.
There was also, I don't think it was the same case. I think this was middle schoolers they had to wear a uniform, and to protest the uniform, they had little buttons that showed Nazi youth marching, and then they had the circle and the dash through it. And teachers said, well, this is pro-Nazism, and the court sided with the students and said it was a public school. They were protesting a government policy. They're still wearing the uniform, but they're showing their protest of it, and it's a government policy, and we're entitled to do that. But sometimes talk to students too about, it's not just always go to court and challenge it in law. Sometimes it's a matter of common sense and going to your school board. For years, both at this and some other conferences I do with high school students, I was told that students could not wear any athletic apparel except for OSU and OU, University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University. And I asked, well, what's the justification? They said, well, it was for gangs, because there's gang violence here, and that will be the problem. And I said, well, the first thing is that tells me that no self-respecting gang would ever wear anything from OSU and OU, which shows the stupidity of that policy. Are you telling me they can't wear American University T-shirts? That's college apparel. So I would tell students for years to argue about this. And I think it was Oklahoma City School District where finally a student wore, it was either Michigan or Michigan State. His family had just moved from Michigan. His parents got upset when the kid was told to take that off. And they finally went to the school board and said, this is kind of nonsense. For one thing, there's not gang violence in every one of these schools, and it has nothing to do with college apparel. And when the publicity came out, I think the school district changed that. And by the way, the student and his parents were also invited up to the university they were representing and were celebrities at halftime, which is a good idea. But it's, I see at some schools when they come to the conference in person where students have pink hair and, are dressed basically however they want. And then at other schools, and I know my son went to Edmond North High School, and we as parents were brought in before their freshman year and told the student dress code was they can't have holes in their blue jeans or they'll be sent home kind of stuff, much less they can't have colored hair. And sometimes, okay, so what does that have to do with learning? And clearly the culture in other schools is we're worried about you showing up and we want you to learn, and we don't care what color your hair is. It's not causing a substantial disruption here. So sometimes that's a matter of going to the school board first and trying to get some common sense applied on these kinds of policies instead of automatically we need to sue. And even getting, sometimes I don't think the school districts or the school boards often realize what the policies are and how they might be applied in some of those cases.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to throw in about dress code while we're talking about that topic. I'm really proud of Oklahoma because we had a case going back to 1976 where our Supreme Court found that length of hair was just one of those things that the school couldn't control. It wasn't reasonably connected to its educational mission. And in the 1970s and 60s, that was a question among many of the circuit courts of lots of these hair cases of where does the school's ability to regulate something like that start and stop? And the court there didn't even rule based on First Amendment. They ruled based on what is the authority of the school board. So there's lots of different things when it comes to dress code. There's the First Amendment. There is what is the school's authority, but also, is it being applied differently based on gender? Or, are yoga pants prohibited on females, but it doesn't say anything about males, or short skirts? That's one thing we've seen a lot and have dealt a lot with. So when it comes to dress code, there's many interactions with the law, and many times when it comes to First Amendment issues that we're dealing with, it has to do with a student that wears a shirt with a specific message on it, and is this going to create an issue?
In that case, and actually I have my students read some on that case as well, the state Supreme Court here. And the court was saying, because if you're regulating it for school, you're regulating it for 24/7, actually, and found that it had no connection to teaching and learning to regulate the length of hair. And and I find people that are surprised that case exists in Oklahoma. And I find sometimes running the school officials, teachers and stuff, have no idea they couldn't actually control that. So
a lot of them are concerned about, football players with long hair, and is it going to create a safety issue? And I always try to point out, well, there's lots of professional players that have long hair too. So,
that's correct.
And to show you how difficult these are, piggybacking right off my colleagues here, there's a federal district court case in Nashville, Tennessee, where a kid was playing football at Hendersonville High School. And he had long hair, and the coach said, "You don't play if you don't cut it." Sues in federal district court, and the school wins. So it's not always, it's difficult. I think a lot of times those are brought under a due process liberty interest. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is sometimes the adoptions of these dress codes and uniforms really bother parents. And so parents will file a 14th Amendment based challenge. They try to sort of piggyback that to Meyer v. Nebraska and some of these older cases in the 20s about that this infringes on the parents' right to rear their children as they see fit. And that was an element of an amicus brief that I actually joined in the Mahanoy case. That was principally authored by Catherine Ross. But, when you start disciplining students for purely off-campus online stuff, really that should be a matter of parental discipline more so than school discipline. And that was, I think that was a significant part of what Justice Gorsuch was, or Alito, one of them was saying in their opinion and their concurring opinion.
Yeah. This discussion of dress codes reminds me of when I was in 8th grade, and the school that I attended in Minnesota allegedly had some gang activity, and they came over the loudspeaker one day as I sat in choir and announced that we would no longer be allowed to wear solid blue and black together because that was gang colors. And I was sitting in choir with brand new black jeans and a blue silk shirt that I was very excited about, and came home, almost in tears to my mom, like, I finally got the shirt I wanted and now I can't wear it. And so to my knowledge, no one was ever actually sent home for their clothing at the school. But I wish I knew this stuff back then. I might have pushed a little harder.
Yeah, we have a state law that allows school boards to prohibit gang-related apparel, which a lot of schools will prohibit the color red or the color blue. There is one good case out there. It's older now. I think it's from 1993, called Jeglin versus San Jacinto Unified School District, where a high school was prohibiting the wearing of all sports-related apparel. And the federal district court there did invalidate that on First Amendment grounds. So there is some good case law out there, but you really have to hunt for it sometimes if you're on the student side in the dress code arena.
Yeah.
One thing I always try to point out for schools too is usually I try to tell them you need to try to be able to establish that there is some hint of gang activity in your school district. If you are a very rural school district with a very small student population, it's much harder to make an argument of banning what you would call gang-related apparel when you have absolutely no history of it being not only within your school but within your city or even county. So that can be a factor.
Great point. There's a case. I don't know why I remember this case. The Chalifo case out of Texas. Chalifous, I think. The kid was an honor roll student, straight A's, and he wears rosary beads that I think his grandmother had given him. And it's gang-related apparel. Now, he ended up prevailing ultimately, but it took the intervention and lawyers to help him. And that's exactly right. Like some of these definitions of gang-related apparel are just too all-encompassing, Yeah.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, so maybe we could go around. And a final question is, what do you see as the next frontier, or where do you see the struggles on balance about First Amendment in schools and with school boards that we should be paying attention to in the next few years? And Tony, I'll start with you.
I think right now there's still just a lot of uncertainty when it comes to online postings. I mean, that's where most of speech is happening nowadays when it comes to students and even adults. And school districts are really going to have to grapple when it comes to threats and things, bullying online, of where that line is. Because yes, we do have a clear answer from the Supreme Court. There's still lots of questions to be answered in terms of where does that line start to stop.
David, how about you?
Yeah, I definitely what Tony said. The Tinker case itself, there are really two parts to that case, and one is dominated for decades: reasonable forecast of substantial disruption, or the substantial disruption test. The court also indicated that one of the reasons why John and Mary Beth Tinker could wear the black peace armbands is they didn't interfere with the rights of others. And so this other is often referred to as the forgotten part of Tinker, invasion of the rights of others. And the United States Supreme Court has never told us exactly when student speech invades the rights of other students. We just have a small smattering of lower court decisions. And in the age of cyberbullying, that's something that's going to have to be decided, is when exactly does student speech invade the rights of others? Do we set that on a sort of a tort liability type standard, or is it looser?
And I would agree with Tony that the I think David actually said this earlier too, we're a long way from actually figuring out how the online speech is going to be dealt with. But another version, and of course, online social media keeps changing and evolving to different formats. But I think one thing we may have seen more, and as we see more online learning, the cases or situations where students are being punished for speech at their own home while they're online, and it's not even necessarily speech they're saying or doing, it's something in the background. So as that online presence comes into our own homes during the day for the education, that may be an issue. Pandemic sort of brought it to the front, but it may continue, I think.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you all for being here so much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I know I have learned something. I hope that our audience has as well. But have a good week. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
All right, folks. Well, we are moving right along. We've got 1 hour left of the First Amendment Congress. It'll be starting at 11 o'clock. So like we did last time, we're going to take a short break. There'll be a little video with some music to let you know, and a countdown. When we come back, we will see you at 11 to talk about the First Amendment, protesting, and how states are legislating around those issues. So come back in just a minute. Hello and welcome back to First Amendment Congress 2021. Thanks so much for joining us for our third and final panel discussion of the day. Thank you so much for being with us throughout this morning. It's been a really great conversation about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, other freedoms as well, and where they intersect with students. I will say, if you are watching this live with us today, excellent. This video will be archived on YouTube and on our Facebook page or Facebook group. I will also go in later and divide it out into individual sections. So if you happen to want to share this with someone or watch it later, hanging out on Friday night with a bowl of popcorn and some panel discussions about the First Amendment is how I like to spend my time. You are certainly welcome to, and those will all be on the FOI Oklahoma YouTube channel. All right, so our third panel today, we have some illustrious guests who I'm going to bring on here one at a time. First is Melvin Hall. Melvin is an attorney who represents the NAACP of Oklahoma. Good morning, Melvin.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. Also joining us is Abby Henderson, who is a partner at Movement Catalyst. They're a group based in D.C., although I will say she's a former Oklahoman, and we all know that once you're an Oklahoman, you're always an Oklahoman. So welcome, Abby. And then also joining us is Elly Page, who's with the International Center for Nonprofit Law. I'll bring Elly on. They track a lot of anti-protest legislation around the country, and so we're excited to hear her information and thoughts on stuff today. Welcome, Elly.
Hi, Andy.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. I think we'll start with, last year we saw legislation in many states, including Oklahoma, that were targeting protesting, right? Many of these were so-called, I guess they would redefine the word riot in some ways. Elly, as I mentioned, your organization tracks and monitors this kind of legislation. Can you give us an overview of what trends you are seeing nationwide?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here, and thanks to all the students and other folks who are tuning in today on this very important topic. So as you say, we've been tracking these anti-protest laws since 2017. So it's been almost 5 years now. And what we've seen over and over is that when people gather together to protest, that is to exercise their First Amendment right to peacefully assemble and express some concern or desire as a group, some lawmakers respond not by listening and addressing protesters' concerns, but by trying to limit protests, sort of chipping away this fundamental constitutional right. Since 2017, we've seen 230 different bills from 45 of our 50 states, almost 100 bills just in this past year. And Andy, maybe is there some way to share the link to our protest law tracker with the audience?
Yep, I just put it in the chat. Yep.
Fantastic. So since we've seen these bills kind of pop up in response to protest movements, it's maybe not surprising that we've seen so many bills after Americans turned out in really record numbers last year to protest for racial justice. But it's an extremely concerning trend. The bills we've seen restrict protest rights in 4 key ways. So I'm just going to briefly touch on each of these. So first, the bills create serious new ways of punishing protesters. So under a new law in Tennessee, if you're in a protest and you block traffic on a street, or even if you block pedestrians on a sidewalk, you can spend up to a year in jail. So if you think about the protests you've seen or been part of, or even historic protests like civil rights marches, where did they take place? It probably took place in a street or on a sidewalk, right? So now you have a whole huge area that's essentially off limits for protesting. And this is a really common tactic that we've seen in these bills, targeting street protests, introducing these harsh new criminal penalties, particularly for blocking traffic. 2, the bills, many of them are written with really ambiguous language in ways that can trip up protesters. And Andy, you referenced this, and the title of the panel references this in the definition of rioting, which has been a pretty common object of many of these bills. So you have a new law like the one in Florida that was passed last year that makes it a felony to quote unquote riot. And a felony is obviously a really serious crime. But according to the law, if a big group of people are peacefully protesting, a huge group and a couple of people sort of way over here, maybe get a little rowdy, maybe kick over a garbage can or maybe push someone, then everyone in that big group can be accused of rioting. In fact, the definition of riot in the Florida law is so vague that last month a judge said, well, that's just plainly unconstitutional. Like, you can't have such broad language that someone peacefully exercising their constitutional rights can be suddenly arrested for a felony. And the language is so vague in the law that people won't know what the law says. They won't be able to conform their behavior to be acting within the law, and police won't know how to enforce it. So I just use this as an example, but there are a lot of them in these bills of how lawmakers are trying to discourage protesting by creating these kind of vaguely defined new crimes. Third, we're also seeing anti-protest laws that target not only protesters themselves, but people and organizations that support them and work with them. So you may have heard about various protests against gas and oil pipelines. A lot of people in states across the country gathered to protest the construction of pipelines because of the harm they'll do to the environment, or because they run across land of Indigenous Americans. Under new law in Indiana, if you help someone who participates in a protest near a gas and oil pipeline, you might have to pay a huge fine, like $100,000. A lot of enacted laws target organizations that help protesters too, again, by introducing these potential new fines for organizations that support or encourage or fund or otherwise work with people who engage in these kinds of protests. So it's creating a big risk for people and groups who want to exercise their First Amendment rights. And that's been an issue, these sort of broad, especially using sort of conspiracy language. It's been an issue in Oklahoma laws too, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will touch on that. And finally, fourth, this is probably the scariest element of these bills, but many of them make it easier for people to hurt protesters. How do they do that? Well, for example, a law in Iowa says that if someone drives their car into a group of protesters, maybe they hurt someone, maybe they even kill someone, the law says that in some circumstances, the driver can't be sued. There's a similar issue under Oklahoma law and a new law in Florida. This is especially kind of horrific because there have been a lot of incidents, especially recently, of people ramming their cars into protests. Since the start of the George Floyd protests, over 130, this has happened over 130 times. It's injured over 100 people and killed 3 people. And if you have a law that protects someone that does that, then maybe it happens more often because people have this sense that the state will take their side. And meanwhile, people who would otherwise turn out to a protest say, well, I don't want to risk being hit by a car, so I'm just going to stay home. So it's just a quick summary of what we've seen in these bills and why they're so concerning, creating really extreme criminal punishments for protesters, using vague language in ways that can cover peaceful and constitutionally protected protest activity, kind of casting a wide net, so you're targeting not only protesters, but people and organizations that help them, and making it easier for people to hurt and even kill protesters without facing civil consequences. So it's extraordinarily concerning. I mean, protest is obviously so essential to our democracy and essential to our history as Americans. So really troubling to see these efforts to chip away at a core constitutional right.
Yeah. Man, I'm having flashbacks to our last legislative session here in Oklahoma where many of these laws were proposed and in some cases passed. And so we will talk more about several of these later in this panel. Abby, I want to kind of go to you next. Your organization essentially helps organizations strategize their advocacy and in some cases protests. On the ground, how do you see the effect of these laws on the public's willingness to exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to pick up right where Elly left off. I mean, I think the core thing that these laws do, and even the discussion of these laws, Because as I think you know, and maybe people watching know, there were like 12 bills introduced in Oklahoma related to this topic. So even the kind of like public discussion about what the penalties might be can have a really huge chilling effect on people who are wanting to go out and make their voices heard. As Elly said, you know, a traditional place for protest is the street or the sidewalk. And I think when there's the passing of these bills, the discussion of these bills, people are unsure about what actually got enacted. If they've heard about a broader set of things and punishments, they are unsure about how these laws will be enforced. And I think, you know, that is a really key point, because one thing we talk about when we talk about these protest laws is like many of the things that are a part of these discussions or are like the biggest red flags in these discussions are already illegal. Like what these bills do is create a platform for a conversation about things that like aren't really even problems. And then they provide cover for elected officials who want to make this their issue to pass laws that are more and more restrictive. So, you know, if you're a person who regularly, we're working with a big, you know, national distributed voting rights group who I have had a conversation with one of their co-founders and legal counsels saying like, when it comes to Florida, they've totally changed their strategy because they are predominantly black and brown people. They're worried about enforcement of the similar protest law that has passed, and they don't want their people, you know, taken to jail, number one, and they don't know like what charges really will come about from those laws. So I think we are unquestionably seeing kind of the difference in how people are thinking about risks when we're talking about these laws and how much they're willing to do. I mean, I'm very, you know, lucky to be doing this work in a place where, to Elly's point about the difference in penalties, like when you block a street here in DC, the consequence is essentially getting the same thing as a parking ticket. You're in violation of a law that prohibits incommoding or blocking a street or blocking a sidewalk. And the penalty is $50. It's a fine, it's a citation. You can go and pay it. And it's very like, people are willing to take that risk when they're standing up for something that they really believe in. When we move in the opposite direction, where we're talking about felony charges and even like RICO claims, which Elly alluded to, like conspiring to riot, people don't know. That's a totally different risk calculation than I'm okay to pay $50 and have this arrest on my record. I'm not willing to be a convicted felon, which, as we all know, has like all these different ramifications that like may or may not be legitimate. And it's just a whole different calculus for people. So I think more than anything, the chilling effect is what is really, really concerning about these laws. And we're seeing it in our work.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. A $50 ticket is a sharp contrast to some folks here in Oklahoma County who got charged with domestic terrorism, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
An unequal application there.
Yeah.
Melvin, I want to go to you. Oklahoma House Bill 1674, which passed back in the spring and did several of the things that Elly mentioned earlier, right? It has a component about protecting drivers who believe that they are in danger and are fleeing a so-called riot. And if they hit, injured, or killed someone, it also deals with blocking public roadways and the unequal penalties that we were just talking about. Can you give us maybe a better description of what the bill does? And then we'll talk about where things are at with it right now.
Yes, thank you for having me. This is a very, very important topic because, as the other panelists have indicated, the right to protest in the First Amendment is sacred. Many of the privileges that we enjoy today, the right to vote, equal employment opportunity, were all a part of protests and demonstrations, and that's what caused those laws to be enacted. So it's a very important topic, and but this particular House Bill 1674 contains all of those chilling effect provisions, but two in particular were the ones that we attacked in the lawsuit. And I'm happy to announce that on just last week, Thursday of last week, on the 27th, a federal judge here in Oklahoma granted our request for a preliminary injunction. So the law was supposed to go into effect yesterday on November 1st, and the judge has enjoined the law from going into effect, and we're very, very happy about that. Two of the provisions that caused the court to enjoin the enactment of this law was one, the conspiracy component, and that is that if an individual is found to have violated this act by, demonstrating or protesting in a way, then an organization that might, like the NAACP or some other civil rights organization that may have been involved in organizing the particular protest, they can be fined up to 10 times the amount, which is the amount of the fine in the statute was $5,000. So an organization could be fined up to $50,000. And you can understand how that would have a tremendously effective chilling effect on the organization that's trying to peacefully protest. So that provision was enjoined by the preliminary injunction, mainly because conspiracy is, the term conspiracy is not defined, and it's vague. And constitutional law states that if a provision in a statute is vague, so that it's not specific enough to inform the public as to what conduct would constitute, in this case, conspiracy, well, then it must be struck down because it's constitutionally vague. And that's the reason why the judge struck that particular conspiracy provision down, because it was not properly or specifically enough defined. The other aspect of the law that was struck down was the part relating to, again, obstructing traffic or obstructing the public or, blocking passage, which was previously discussed. That also was not defined enough in terms of what constitutes an obstruction, what constitutes blocking traffic, what constitutes interfering with traffic. And since that was not defined enough, was very vague, could be wildly interpreted by law enforcement, a law enforcement officer could construe any type of activity as being obstructing traffic or obstructing the roadway, including walking across the street. And for that reason, the court said it's too vague, it's not clear enough, no one can understand what that is, and therefore it gives law enforcement unfettered authority to construe any activity as being obstructing traffic. And so she enjoined that provision as well. And so none of those provisions will be enforced or implemented until there's a trial on the merits. So granting of a preliminary injunction does not mean that it's over. It just means that all activity is enjoined pending a trial, and we're going to have that trial. But we feel very good about the fact that there's nothing that they can say that hasn't already been said that's going to change what has occurred here with this statute. and we feel very confident that it will be permanently enjoined after a trial is conducted on the merits.
Do we know when that trial is going to happen?
Well, we're in federal court, so we have a status conference that is scheduled for next month, December 1st. And what happens is you go and meet with the judge, and then a scheduling order is implemented, and then there's a schedule in terms of discovery, more briefing, and then a trial date would be set after that. So I don't know when the case is going to be set for trial, but I would imagine it will be sometime next year. These cases take months and sometimes years to matriculate through federal court. So, but thankfully, during that entire time, this law will not be in effect, and demonstrations can go ahead on without the chilling effect that this law was, I believe, designed to implement to chill such protest. And one final comment on these types of laws, which, as was indicated, are being implemented all across the country. I think a better approach would be to address the issues that's causing the people to protest, rather than trying to chill and block and retard individual protests and demonstrations. So it appears to me that we're addressing this backwards. We want to quiet and suppress demonstrations, but what we should be doing is focusing on what is causing the people to go to the street, what is causing the people to demonstrate and protest. And until we do that, we're going to continue to have exercise of individual rights, and that's the right to protest as protected by the First Amendment.
That's right. Yeah, you treating the symptom on the end, the protest, is not going to ever get to curing what the underlying issue is.
Correct.
Elly, now obviously Oklahoma's laws, as Melvin just said, are currently enjoined and thus cannot be used. In other states where similar legislation passed this year, do you know of any cases where they have been applied to individuals or organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, we do not track the enforcement of these laws. It's quite difficult to get that data because it's at a very local level. And oftentimes there are confidentiality issues. But we know that Oklahoma is not the only law that has been struck down as unconstitutional. As I mentioned, there's the Florida law as well, and I think it's indicative of just the wide net that these laws are trying to cast. And the really problematic tactics that they're using. Again, Florida was this law that introduced all kinds of new penalties, and a lot of them were focused around this sweeping definition of riot, which, as I mentioned, was found just blanketly unconstitutional. So we're hopeful that those tactics, as more of these bills and laws are challenged in court, will keep them from being enforced. But as Abby said, I mean, once you have, it doesn't even take the bill becoming law on the books. Even just the discussion around the bill's language puts the possibility in people's minds that protest will put them in jeopardy of facing extreme criminal penalties or physical danger.
Yeah. It feels like every few years we see a wave of legislation like this that sweeps the country. It's often in the same states, right? Maybe Florida, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri. You get a lot of Midwestern states that you see these bills proposed. And it's not always about anti-protest. Like, it'll be whatever the topic du jour is in politics at that time. And I know that Oklahoma is the I don't know, victim is the right word, but we are the one of the states that has the highest percentage of what's called model legislation, or as we often say, copy and paste legislation, bills that are run here that were authored by a group elsewhere, and they run them in as many states as they can. And I think we have the highest like per capita number of model legislation bills that are proposed and adopted. Are given the similarities in these bills in the different states you've been tracking, are they coming from the same place? Is there a group or a certain set of groups that are pushing these bills, or did they all spring up organically in individual states?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've seen in other contexts where these bills have been sort of word for word copied and pasted in various states. And we know that there are organizations, ALEC is one of them, that produces sort of model legislation that is very effectively spread around. In the context of the bills we've seen since the murder of George Floyd, we don't know that there's sort of actors who are proactively pushing model bills, but whether it's the sort of media coverage of what politicians are proposing, or just the introduction of bills in one state, which then lawmakers in another state say, oh, that's an idea that could get me on TV or whatever. We've definitely seen the same language used from state to state, and certainly the same tactics used.
Sure. Abby, earlier you kind of talked about how people are becoming more wary, or at least aware of these laws, and it is certainly having a chilling effect on speech. How are you, your organization, and those you work with, how are you responding to still, I will say, find ways to exercise someone's First Amendment rights without running afoul of these potentially harsh penalties that these types of laws allow?
Yeah, like I said, I think, even though I'm a native Oklahoman, very proudly, I am lucky to do the movement support work that I do in a very favorable place. I think there are lots of reasons. One being that protesters here in the past in DC have been especially like proactively or reactively litigious when it comes to our law enforcement agencies here, of which there are 36. And so the kind of parameters around the law enforcement relationship with protesters here in DC is like probably the weirdest in the country, just in terms of like the leeway that protesters have here. And I think additionally, we've been doing a lot of work with groups wanting to be at the White House lately. And there is, kind of this comms PR situation around like, Black clergy from Georgia who have been fighting for voting rights, like being arrested by Biden's Secret Service or Biden's Park Police. Like they have a PR, the White House has their own PR calculus around what that looks like. And that's part of this kind of strategy around what my organization does as a movement support organization. Like, how are we building that tension and creating that pressure? I think, so like in that regard, we're very lucky to have kind of this civic space that we do here in DC. I think in regards to states where these bills are being discussed or put into place, it's really difficult. And I have had a bunch of conversations with folks who are still in progressive spaces in Oklahoma around like whose responsibility is it to take up the charge to challenge these laws, like protest or otherwise? Like, who bears that burden, that risk? Because there are, as we have been discussing, can be extreme personal consequences without people like Melvin who are doing proactive work to enjoin pieces of these legislation. Like the other route to overturning these pieces of legislation is someone makes a personal sacrifice. And that's really hard to ask someone to do, because I kind of came to protest work through strategic lawsuits against public participation, which are, when a corporation or other wealthy person sues civilly a protester. A lot of times, as Elly was mentioning, like in the climate space, this happens a lot. And the ramifications of that are like emotional, financial, can be, the tentacles can spread very far in your life to be making that choice to take that risk. So I think that is a really tough conversation to have about how do we challenge these laws and who is in a place to challenge these laws, and are the right people bearing that burden. I mean, we can't pretend that these laws aren't being passed on the heels of the biggest, racial justice uprising of my lifetime. And, is it right for Black and brown people to be the people who have to challenge these laws? I'm not sure that it is. So that's something I definitely think is a tough conversation to be had. Another thing I wanted to mention to what Elly was just saying is we, on the kind of other end of the spectrum, can't forget that Oklahoma was the home of the first critical infrastructure bill, which is this kind of piece of legislation that ended up becoming a piece of model legislation after it was really successful in Oklahoma, that sets all these parameters around things that legislatures can designate as critical infrastructures, which can include pipelines and electricity grids, et cetera, and like really heightened penalties for people who protest around those. So it is. And Andy, I mean, you made this point, but especially in the protest space, like Oklahoma is no stranger to putting up barriers to people, kind of speaking out about different things, but especially like corporate interests in Oklahoma, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most people would agree that it makes sense in certain situations, like the strategic oil reserve that is based in Oklahoma. But when it's projects that haven't even been completed yet, like there's a whole different kind of calculus there that goes along with it. I want to, this whole event today, our First Amendment Congress is aimed at students, and it's about schools and the intersection with students in the First Amendment. So I want to talk a little bit about some school-related things and how these issues might connect. Specifically, one of the other laws that passed in Oklahoma this year addressed, we'll say, protesters, people interrupting public bodies, boards, city councils, school boards, that kind of thing, and criminalizing the interruption or the preventing these bodies from doing their work. Which at the face is, so often that's the point of the protest, right? Is to cause the public body to stop doing what they're doing and listen to the concerns of the people there. And I've only, seen it invoked or threatened a couple of times by elected officials, and it was probably not. It was probably against the group that didn't think that was going to happen to them. But specifically when it goes to school boards, we've seen the Biden administration issue some guidance about how to treat people who are, not just interrupting, but that are in some cases attacking or stalking school board members. How, Elly, for you, is there an intersection for kind of your organization and stuff you monitor with what's happening specifically around school boards?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're focused on bills and laws that restrict peaceful, nonviolent protest tactics. So certainly if there are efforts to prevent people from stalking elected officials or threatening violence against elected officials, that's not something we would consider as really, well, depending on the language in the bill, but threatening kind of core First Amendment rights, and not something we would track as an anti-protest measure. But I think it's definitely something to to watch. I think generally, sort of in thinking about where we're going to see the next anti-protest measures, watching where protests are springing up is going to be really important, because as we've seen, as other panelists have spoken to, we see these bills pop up in response to specific movements, regardless of. I mean, I would say that we generally see the bills in response to protests, maybe on one side of the political spectrum more than the other. But yeah, I think it's that particular body of restrictions, and we've seen it around. We've seen this sort of in the COVID context beyond school boards. I think elected officials who are trying to impose COVID restrictions since the start of the pandemic have faced those kinds of. It's not really fair to call them protests, but really threatening, potentially violent behavior, which again is outside the scope of kind of protected constitutional activity.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I think what I've seen at school boards here may be disruptive, but it's not been scary. But certainly there are dozens or hundreds of reports around the country from folks that there was a Washington Post article earlier this weekend, I think, that detailed some of those. That was truly horrific. I mean, it was very scary. Melvin, go to you to specifically about Oklahoma stuff. If there are, let me think how to phrase this. I guess my question is, from your perspective, your familiarity with this issue, and not asking you to give legal advice, but how would you recommend to Oklahomans who are passionate about a cause and are interested in joining with a protest or organizing a protest of some kind? Are there, I don't know, best practices that they should adhere to before kind of embarking on that endeavor?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that one thing we have to understand, and for the young people, the students who are watching this broadcast need to understand, is just because it does not affect you directly, it does affect you indirectly. And I think there's a disconnect that we've got to reconnect, and that is that a lot of individuals, particularly we're talking about in Oklahoma, don't feel that they have any sort of skin in the game, because whatever the particular issue may be is not affecting them directly. But we have to understand that as a United States citizen or an individual that's in the United States and in Oklahoma in particular, we are affected by these demonstrations, the civil rights violations that are occurring right before our eyes, the legislation that is being passed. All of that is affecting us in some way, in that, for example, with the restrictions on protests and demonstrations, we're looking at somewhat of a selective enforcement. I don't believe that law enforcement will enforce these laws against certain groups the same way they would enforce it against other groups, and particularly here in Oklahoma. And this is a problem. And so the young people who are listening to this broadcast need to understand that we're all in this situation together. We're all in this together, and everyone at minimum can assume their individual responsibility. And that is, when you can say something, you should. If you can write something, you should. If you can go out into the field, into the streets, into your community, and make your voice known on an issue, you should do that. I mean, with social media the way it is today, and the ability to get the word out more universally, everyone, I think, can impact this. we tend to only care and concern ourselves with matters that affect us directly or our family directly. But we really need to get away from that and realize that that's not the case. We're all affected by what's happening. And I'm particularly pleased at the level of outrage and outcry with the murder of George Floyd. I mean, that actually changed the system in a significant way. It also had some negative impacts in terms of all of these laws that are designed to chill demonstration and chill protest. And I certainly agree that even having a discussion about these laws has a chilling effect. And that's the idea. Any publicity about these laws is going to have a chilling effect on people who want to get involved. And we have to work against that and do everything that we can to work against the things that are happening in our society that we may not like and we may not agree with. And we all have a voice to play. Even on an individual student level, everyone can contribute to make our society a better society.
That's exactly right. I'm so glad you said that, Melvin. Several years ago, I led a group of people to the state capitol to advocate for some state budget issues, and one day we had a group of students who decided to march to the Capitol from their high school in the cold, carrying their backpacks and band instruments, and many of their parents came too, and they had no fear. Like, they knew why they were coming. It was very clear, and they had a willingness to, I think, engage with lawmakers in ways that a lot of grownups don't. And it was a refreshing experience to see so many high school students, both here and around the city, who really cared about those issues. And so that's right. Even if you think it might not affect you directly, it certainly will. That's a good lesson. Elly, as we move into 2022 and new state legislative sessions, are we going to expect another round of similar bills? Do you know what we should be on the lookout for?
I mean, I think we can see potentially a number of the bills that maybe didn't get passed this legislative session in states where those bills carry over, them continuing to pop up around quote unquote rioting and around blocking traffic and the like. And then I think a lot will depend on where we see high profile protests in the next few months, whether it's around, I don't know, there are sort of controversial cases at the Supreme Court around abortion, gun rights, et cetera, whether that sparks the next protest movement or whether it's something COVID related or what that looks like. I think that will determine a lot of what we see in the state legislatures next year.
Super, thanks. Abby, as we kind of near the end of our time for this morning, any sage words of advice for students in particular who are at the point that they're thinking about becoming active somehow, whether it's through protest or it's through some kind of advocacy, that are maybe stepping out of their comfort zone and are now nervous after listening to some of this? What's your advice for them?
Yeah, I would say that get plugged into a group or make a group with your friends. I think when it comes to these things, there are kind of power in numbers, and there is power in the kind of story that can be told about young people standing up together. And that's really important and can play an important, role in the way that these laws play out and the way that they're enforced. I also think that getting involved, I wish that I would have gotten involved, with organizing when I was in high school. I think listening and learning and connecting to people who have a different story from you. I know, I had a pretty homogenous community in Oklahoma, and if I would have been willing to like step out of my comfort zone and start organizing around issues that, as Melvin said, like didn't affect me and my family directly, I think that can have a huge impact on an individual person, on a group of people who are thinking about getting together and speaking out, learning the stories of other people, learning about issues that affect your local community. I think like a really good example of this is the Tulsa Race Massacre. As someone who grew up outside, 15 minutes outside of Tulsa my entire life and didn't know about the Race Massacre until I was in college, like the only way that happened was for certain communities to stay silent about something horrific that happened. And so, talking to people who don't look like you, who don't have the same situation as you, learning the history of Oklahoma beyond what you're taught in your Oklahoma history class. Like I had to go to law school and get a certificate in federal Indian law to like really understand the Native history in Oklahoma. I think all of these things are really important, and getting started in your most curious years in high school can be hugely impactful for folks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Melvin, Elly, Abby, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Andy.
All right. Well, this brings us to the end of the 2021 First Amendment Congress. We are so excited for all of you who have been here. We appreciate your time and attention. I hope that you found the conversations today from our experts, from our panelists, to be helpful, engaging, informative. We've talked about everything from dress codes to what you post on social media, to what it means when you protest in the streets. All of this in support are made possible because of the First Amendment. And so I encourage all of you, students, teachers, if you haven't, this sounds really silly, but if you haven't read the First Amendment recently, go back and do it. Because as several people mentioned today, there's wording, there's clauses in there that I think we often forget because we don't see them frequently. But one thing that I think we all know is how important the First Amendment is to our functioning democracy here in America. It's something we should protect, we should uphold, and we should use so that we don't lose it. Okay, on that note, thank you all. Have a lovely end of your day, and we'll see you next year. Whoops.